Mr. Speaker, the majority of the population of the world currently lives in a state where their fundamental civil liberties are frequently disregarded, where they do not have rights and freedoms that the United States believes are integral to the dignity of human beings. And one of the largest superpowers in the world is controlled by a communist state with interests directly contrary to those of the United States that seeks to become the next global hegemon. The United States is at a current position in history where it has the ability to change the makeup and fix all of these problems, to change China moving forward to a more democratic, more respectful society that has interests that are not opposed to, but rather aligned with the United States. It would be foolish not to take this opportunity. We're going to tell you how you'll do it, why it will work, and why it is important for the United States on Side First Government today. Our model is that the United States, through their State Department, like the National Endowment for Democracy, will provide funding and know-how and assistance to groups in China that seek to liberalize China. We will only talk to non-violent groups that have a good history and reputation of lodging peaceful protests. We will talk with groups in various regions. We will talk to local leaders who seek to be able to send these sorts of demonstrations and create positive political change in China. So we would definitely support, say, the protests going on in Hong Kong and that organization. They meet our standards. So how would we do this? It's something that we've done many, many times in the past. The United States has a storied history and a great institutional knowledge and capacity for sowing democracy in other parts of the world, like in Latin America or in Eastern Europe. We know how to go in and work with local leaders to get sorts of these things done, and this is the same mechanism that we will do. Okay, so why do we think, clarification? Sure.
Would these operations be clandestine or would they be open?
Okay, they would be clandestine. We would not tell people that we are doing this. We would not put US flags at these protests. We would go in, work with the leaders, keep it on the DL. That's fine. Okay. So why will this help to mobilize the population? The status quo in China is you have a burgeoning middle class that is increasingly growing in civil unrest and is getting tired of being detained without habeas corpus, is tired about having their internet censored, is getting tired about not having fundamental freedoms that they see other people having elsewhere in the world. That's why when in Hong Kong the government tells you, oh wait, we're not actually going to allow you to be self-representative, millions and millions of people show up and say this is no longer acceptable. We are now at a point in China where it is beginning to erode, these protests are beginning to erode the idea that the state is an authoritarian state which can never be challenged. We think that by getting these groups the ability, the funding, and the know-how to stage large public protests, you can change the way that citizens in China view their role in their interaction with their government. You can send the message that you no longer sit down and do what the government tells you, but when the government doesn't give you rights that you want, then you are able to mobilize. You will not be attacked. You will not be downtrodden. That it is a right that you have. We think that this is critically important, and that by changing the norms around protest and around civilian government interaction, then you get greater pressure on the Chinese government from its population. Why is this pressure likely to succeed? Because China has a lot of people, Mr. Speaker, and quite frankly, if you have billions of citizens who show up and protest, or who do things like don't go to work, or do things like protest and block off major ports, we think that this is something that really stops this country from working. China is so vast and so large, and the state apparatus is so not able to be applied to this, that they have to make democratic concessions at the local level. We think that you are very likely going to get a concession to local democratized kind of forces, and this changes democracy in China to exist in the first place. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
So aren't these concessions more likely to be like the concession they made to Hong Kong in the form of allowing them to choose between pre-selected candidates?
Yeah, the problem is that is not a real concession, and the Chinese people are not okay with that concession, right? When you see the Chinese government trying to not accord them these civil rights, that's where you get this enormous uproar. We think that this actually has an effect on the Chinese government, and we can magnify the size and the frequency of these uproars and make it such that the Chinese government cannot afford to maintain its current oppressive tax. Okay, what are the practical benefits to the United States and the moral benefits to the United States? Why do we want a democratic China? Firstly, principally, we believe, as the United States and as Western liberal democracies writ large, that the right to not be ruled, but rather to participate in your democratic process is a fundamental human right to which all humans should have access. We think that principally, if you, as the United States, are in a position where you are able to create a world for billions of people, where their government will listen to them, where they will be less oppressive, where they will not be thrown in jail when they protest, where their speech will not be refrained from being published, this is a moral obligation that you have to help other human beings in the world. We are very proud, on a moral sense, to say that the United States benefits in this way from helping these people and has an obligation to because of the position that it currently exists in. Okay. But secondly, we think that there are practical benefits here. So firstly, like generating goodwill with the Chinese people, right? The United States is a democratic force and advocates for democracy. We think that if you get a China where the dominant state apparatus is more democratic, then you get a China whose leaders are more friendly towards a similar democratic state in the United States. The way that China exists currently is that their leadership structure have a completely separate worldview from that of the United States. This makes it very, very difficult to cooperate because you see the United States as having an opposing worldview. We think that when you have the United States and China governed by similar political philosophies, you are likely to get better collaboration. You are likely to see less aggression towards the United States in its interests in Asia, and you are more likely to have sort of a gratitude from the people of China. Say if there is a democratic overthrow and you do get some sort of democratic real tenure in China, then the United States can say we helped to create this. That goodwill will carry through with the population of China, will carry through with the future democratic leaders of China, and will lead to better outcomes in US-China relationships. Secondly, we think that you get practical benefits because China is seeking to become the next world leader and the next world hegemon, right? We think that having the Communist Party of China, who has very advanced political agendas, being in charge of the state apparatus, is harmful to the United States' interest in the South China Sea and in Asia. Whereas if you had a more civilian-based organization that was leading the country, then they might focus more on things like civil liberties, more on things like welfare, more on things like making sure that China runs effectively internally as a state. We think that having a body that is run by civilians who care about their own well-being, rather than, say, the nationalist importance of China, which is propagated by the Communist Party of China that currently leads, you get a less aggressive China. And this is beneficial to US interests politically. We think that if you have democracy come out as the dominant worldview, then this cements the United States' role as a beacon of democracy and as a world power. You demolish China's ability to have a communist angle to this. We think it's incredibly beneficial. Mr. Speaker, the United States is currently able to give fundamental rights and liberties to billions of people and to ensure that its interests will be protected in the future. We want a democratic China.
I thank that speaker for his remarks and call upon the Leader of Opposition to open up the case for the opposition today.
Attempting to force China into democratic reform earlier than it would do that organically will backfire massively and entrench the communist oppression that its government so opposes. China was moving towards democracy before the Tiananmen Square protests, or at least towards more open politics, but cracked down afterwards. China right now is no longer even a functionally communist regime. It's slowly liberalizing its markets, allowing more trade, and introducing more Western culture and products, which forces it to engage in legal, social, and political reforms as it engages in the international arena economically and socially. These sorts of organic reforms can bring about meaningful change, but intervening in right now will backfire. Three major issues in this debate. Firstly, we're going to say that the United States' primary obligation is to its own citizens and how this co-ops and corrupts resources that need to be devoted at home. Secondly, why it's going to backfire and actually harm democratic development and human rights in China. And thirdly, why it's bad for US interests at home and abroad. Before that, two quick points of rebuttal. We heard from the LO, we've succeeded at creating democracy before, and we're really good at it. Wait, what about Afghanistan and Iraq, which are on the verge of collapse right now? Communist regimes in Venezuela and Cuba, and civil war in the Ukraine. When we try to intervene and promote democracy elsewhere, it fails far more often than it succeeds, and it fails leading to people dying and suffering further oppression than they would without action at all. Secondly, they tell us, we're going to have lots of goodwill from the Chinese people. No, we're not. We're going to be portrayed in Chinese propaganda as subversives, threatening the stability of their world if it's ever even suspected that the United States is involved in these, which means that the government propaganda will cement this during and after the protest, leading to massive antipathy towards Americans. But even if in some mythical world this was successful, and it's successfully clandestine, China will just co-opt the narrative, and the existing powers that be will still hate the United States for potentially being involved, which means that we don't get any optical benefits to the United States, but rather optical benefits against the United States. So first major point of construction, why our primary obligation is at home. We tell you that the primary obligation of any state, and particularly the United States in this scenario, is towards its own citizens. Firstly, because there are ongoing major problems in the United States. They talk about Hong Kong and oppression, we want to talk about Ferguson and oppression, right? What we tell you is that there are people right now who don't have democratic or basic human rights in the United States. But the United States is much better able to effect change domestically through open and political methods than it is abroad. And so it has a primary obligation to devote its resources where they'll be most effective. But moreover, it's democratically accountable to its own citizens, and therefore has its primary obligation to them. The problem, however, is that when the US government directs its attention, money, and human resources towards this international effort, it's misdirecting them away from domestic politics. But more importantly, it's misdirecting public attention that's necessary to get meaningful political change at home. We tell you that public attention often gets siphoned away by international crises, especially when we're talking about destabilization as a country as important to the United States as China. We'd say that that leads to less real concern for the human needs of Americans. As a good example of this, you can see how wars typically ignite nationalistic fervor that makes us forget about domestic divisions and rally behind some leader relatively blindly, see like the war in Iraq and what that did to domestic US politics. An international crisis on the scale of an attempted democratic revolution in China will certainly bring that about and lead to less media and popular will to create reforms here at home. Therefore, the US will be failing in its obligation to protect and to help its own citizens. Secondly, why won't this work will actually increase anti-democratic policy and action in China? Sure.
On this whole Americans first thing, would you then cut aid to stay starving people in developing countries? You can do both.
This doesn't create aid to people in starving countries, doesn't create the media attention and drive away the political discourse and create the rally behind leader effect that we talked about just now. But please engage the actual analysis. So, why will this backfire? China does not tolerate structural dissent. See, for example, Tiananmen Square, right? The same party ideology that existed back then in terms of consolidating power within the party still exists today. And they haven't yet cracked down on Hong Kong, but we say that that's only because Hong Kong protests have not yet escalated to the scale that they think it will. China will absolutely crack down on any protests that are either substantially larger in scale than the Hong Kong protests, that are, for example, closer to the capital in Beijing and therefore more immediately threatening to the regime's sense of security, or if it looks like any of these protests are likely to actually meaningfully work. Because any threat of creating democracy or democratic reform in China is a direct threat to the party hierarchy as it exists right now. The incentive structure is always, therefore, to crack down on it when it looks bad. But when China cracks down, it's not halfway. They use tanks, they use violence, they use fraudulent show trials of the leaders, they use increased media censorship in the face of insecurity because you, when you protest, are now an enemy of the state and an enemy of the party. We tell you that these sorts of crackdowns actually worsen the humanitarian status of all individuals in China. Not just the individuals who are protesting, but everyone who now has to suffer under increased scrutiny, increased security, increased risk of violence, and increased state intrusion into their lives. We tell you that that leads fundamentally to populations being cowed and ceasing to demand the smaller democratic reforms and smaller concessions that are being demanded in the status quo without the United States intervention. Those include the right to organize at all, even on a small scale, the ability to gain any internal media attention because censorship will increase even more than it already is. The threats to persons who might dissent will prevent people from joining these movements or voicing dissent against them so that the action after the first couple of attempts, which we won't work, will totally go away at all. And also just stricter control over media and all public communication, so it's harder to organize these in the first place. And the thing is, people know that this is going to happen and know that this is this country that they live in. So you won't see billions and billions of workers setting down their tools and refusing to work like the LO whimsically claims is going to happen. It's too radical for them, it's too risky for them personally, and you're not going to see that level of reform. Finally, why is this bad for the United States? We tell you firstly that it's bad for the United States domestically. And that also, all of the stuff I put in my first point also applies here for why it's bad domestically, right? But we also tell you that fundamentally Americans see China as kind of an other, right? In domestic US politics, China is not an entity that we're particularly concerned with trying to help the same way we are with starving individuals in Africa. What that means is that devoting resources to helping there, if it ever becomes evident to the US public that it's happening, will just really piss off a bunch of Americans and destabilize our ability to meaningfully intervene or help into the international arena at all. But again, it's also an unjust allocation of resources away from Americans still struggling for their own democratic rights. Finally, we tell you that this is going to have major harms to US international politics and international goals, because China is not going to democratize, and instead its response is going to be on a scale from heightened animosity to active retaliation against the United States in a variety of arenas. One of these is going to be reluctance to cooperate in international forums where the US and China are often the most important actors. That includes the UN Security Council when we're trying to deal with like Russia and its actions in Ukraine, or trying to deal with sanctions in Iran. It also includes the five-party talks and trying to get North Korea to disarm, where China is one of the most essential parties in helping the United States bring them to the table. When the US sacrifices these goals by pissing off China, it's actively hurting itself in other arenas. Moreover, we think that they're going to actively retaliate through anti-US propaganda. Like, people within China we think are going to be less likely and willing to buy US goods or cooperate with US companies, therefore creating a huge economic burden on the United States because they're a major trading partner. But they'll also double down on a regional sphere of influence that they're developing, like the current free trade agreement they're negotiating with South Korea, and try to spread anti-US propaganda in that region where we're currently fighting for hegemonic control. For all of these reasons, I'm very happy to agree.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and this House is now pleased to recognize the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What we've heard today from the opposition is a case that misunderstands the reality of the Chinese state today that Joe brings to you. It is not a state that is in the position it was in 1989, nor is it a state that it was in the position of at the beginning of the 2000s. It is a state that is increasingly rife with domestic protests. It is a case and a country where we think the ability of American aid to make a tangible difference is at a uniquely effective point in history now. I want to talk about two things. I want to first talk to you about the position the Chinese government is in right now, add to the stuff Joe talked to you about. I then want to talk to you particularly about why I think this is an effective way to ferment democracy. Then I want to refute everything we've heard coming out of the opening opposition. The Chinese state spends more on internal domestic security than it does on its own military. That should tell you something about the kinds of threats the Chinese state faces and what the leadership perceives to be its biggest problems in the modern day. The reality is that especially at a point where the eyes of the world are on Hong Kong and an increasingly international protest, one of the biggest concerns the Chinese state has is that these kinds of protests become flashpoints for further places of unrest throughout the country, the western provinces, and in places like Tibet. The problem is, as Joe tells you, the obstacle that is facing these democracy movements is there is a small circle of people and intellectuals who are willing to take up the cause of democracy. But what they lack is a means to connect to the millions of ordinary Chinese citizens who are frustrated by their government's inability to run their country properly and are concerned about the environment, about the inequality in their country, and have legitimate concerns that a movement, and an effective democracy movement, can co-opt into a powerful force. That's what I think we allow the Chinese democracy movement to do in this case. Why will this be effective? Because I think what we allow these people to do is provide them with tools to which there are massive marginal returns for us. We allow them to hack the Great Firewall of China and organize in a much better way. We allow them to have institutional expertise in how anti-communist and pro-democracy protests run and how to structure these movements in a way that is inclusive of the various different factions within China that are opposed to the regime as well. And we also give them funding, which I think is critical in many places where the government controls access to jobs and economic power. I think funding is also critically important to these individuals. I think we have a chance to make a meaningful difference in the lives of the Chinese people. I don't think that has actually been engaged with in terms of effectiveness by the opposition. What do they engage with? A number, no thank you, of strange things. First, they tell us that, look, obviously Iraq was terrible, Afghanistan was terrible, we can't create democracy. Perhaps the problems we faced there had more to do with the military invasion nature of those interventions rather than the kind of mechanism that me and Joe are proposing. The US government, in many cases that are not widely talked about in the media, has incredible expertise in working with opposition movements, trying to give them very low-key expertise and give them funding in a way that doesn't anger the international sphere, doesn't attract media headlines, but is still of tremendous value to those opposition movements. This is especially true, no thank you, in Eastern Europe in many states, where anti-communist regimes have benefited greatly from the introduction of US aid. The next thing we hear from them is that the Chinese government, as a result of this policy, is going to start portraying America negatively in its propaganda. No one in this room, I don't know if anyone has been to China, I haven't, but really, if you look at Chinese propaganda now, it is not exactly glowing in its praise of the United States. Look at the reaction that Occupy Central gets from the Chinese government. it is functionally no different whether or not we fund them, because the Chinese government propaganda already tells you that it's foreign controlled. It already tells any nascent protest movement and spreads propaganda that they are funded by the West. I don't think we actually lose anything in terms of a change of perception that Chinese propaganda can now do. Furthermore, the very people we are funding, the leaders and the potential leaders of the pro-democracy movement, don't exactly buy into Chinese propaganda in the way that they're concerned about. I also think that the people that they would attract have managed to look past Chinese propaganda given the current state of unrest and dissatisfaction that affects them in a much more real way than any propaganda ever could. What do we hear then from them in terms of substantive? We hear a couple of very interesting points I haven't heard for years. We firstly hear that we need to focus on other things. We need to focus on Ferguson and oppression and other things. Basically like the argument of we can't fund foreign aid because we need to fund healthcare and education and really good things. I simply don't think that that is in any way a normative contribution to this debate. This is about whether or not these are valid objectives. If they are valid objectives, I think we should fund them. I'm not sure that that is in any way a specific argument, no thank you, for this resolution. Also, if you want to talk about like where you get the biggest bang for your buck, the kinds of things we're actually providing to these movements aren't tremendously expensive to provide, right? There are things where I think we have massive marginal returns on our investment to them. I don't even want to really talk about marginal returns on investment in a much deeper moral debate, but yeah, you do have those. Let's talk then about what they say about how it distracts the American people from, no thank you, bigger and more important issues. So, for anyone who watched our semi, this is a slight about turn, but I think the US, like citizens of the United States, are capable of paying attention to multiple issues at once. The kinds of things they have to do. But more importantly, this is also not an argument against any foreign intervention or any war ever, because it might distract you from other issues without lending any contribution to this specific one. We then hear, I'll take you a bit bigger. We hear about Tiananmen Square and retrenchment, that there will be severe backlash by China against this policy. Number of points. Firstly, it ignores the context Joe provided you for this debate, that these protests are happening, and the Chinese government doesn't crack down on them in the way that they assert they will. Because firstly, the eyes of the international community are now on China in a way they never was in 1989. The Chinese government's institutional capacity to stop unrest across a massive country with 1 billion people simply don't exist in the way that opening opposition would have you believe. I think that the assertions they give you about retrenchment are incredibly assertive. One second. And worst of all, when we tell you, at the point at which we tell you that these protests are happening anyway, that crackdown is likely to come in any case. But what we give you is a way to make sure that those crackdowns are less effective, and we end up having goodwill among the Chinese population, and the regime comes next quickly.
Given that the state of the United States-China relations is already highly tenuous with massive expansions on tariff policy and a potential trade war, how do you think this will affect that rather than just
Awesome. I was hoping we could pre-butt the US-China relations point without making it too weird. So yes, that is obviously a very important point that is important to talk about. 3 responses we have. First, in the status quo right now, when we're talking about US-China relations, we're not talking about particularly strong relations. The way that China is orienting, for example, its military development moving forward is specifically in response to the US military capacity involving aircraft carriers. They developed lasers to shoot down US satellites over the South China Sea. I think the way that China is developing and orienting itself in the future is decidedly against the US. Second, the analysis Joe gives you about future relations with China, at the point where a democratic change is likely to come anyway, means we are likely to be favored by those people if and when they gain concessions and come to power because of the formative role we played in their change as well. Lastly, given the degree of economic intertwinement between the US and China, any steps and retaliatory measures that China takes end up worsening its own domestic situation. Because when the US retaliates in kind and China's economy worsens, the very protests they're concerned about amplify and get worse as well. That's why US-China relations, I think, ultimately fall on our side of the house, as does the rest of the debate. Thank you.
We thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I want to bring you 2 new arguments in this debate. There'll be lots of rebuttal interwoven. First of all, the question of whether China is right now in a particularly unique position that we've never seen before, and that we're going to be able exactly at this moment to make more significant change than if we allow it to manifest itself from a more grassroots level, continue without United States intervention, continue without radically escalating the protests right now. So we get from side opening government that China is way more liberal than it's ever been in the past. Well, in the 80s, leading up to the Tiananmen Square protests, there was a rising tide of liberal sentiment within China. There were local liberal protests happening in rural China that the Chinese government saw such crackdown into the Tiananmen Square massacre was because if these protests ever reach Beijing, if they ever reach any appearance of solvency, that is when the Chinese government is going to substantially crack down. That is where you get the analysis that Griffin brings you and really doesn't get addressed about how creating great escalation at this very moment or spreading it into the capitals of Beijing will actually result in the opposite of the goals that front government is trying to bring you today. You're actually going to see more anti-liberal policies within China, and they're like, China couldn't get any worse. It definitely could, because right now there is an active military suppression of the democratic protests in Hong Kong. They're like, well, now the eyes of the world are on China, so they couldn't do anything that anti-liberal. This is like an argument from 1949 before China was open. The eyes have been on them for a while, and they really don't mind doing things that radically violate human rights. In fact, when any other country accuses China of human rights violation, that's an affront to China itself, and it will deal with that as an insult to China's dignity, not as something that they're willing to address. They just don't care. So then they're like, propaganda isn't that effective. People are too smart for that. The propaganda in China is 100% backed up with efficacy both in the media and efficacy in terms of actual direct physical engagement with these protesters. It's not a propaganda of words, it's a propaganda of fear, and it's something that people buy into whether or not they're intelligent, whether or not they can watch more than one news program at once. We tell you that the sort of anti-liberal crackdowns we're going to see are going to be the sort of thing which will restrict people's right to publicly collect it all. More anti-liberal propaganda in the media, like there couldn't be more. Yes, there definitely could, and it can involve the names and faces of the actual protesters that we're going to fund and set up on a pedestal. Set them up on a pedestal for absolute defeat, absolute ostracization from Chinese society if we set them up as the faces of this movement and refuse to front it as the United States on our own. We're just going to use them as our pawns in a game that we will lose. We tell you that they're also going to lose access to meaningful communication. No, thank you. Then we tell you that, they tell you that domestic security gets more funding in China than the military, and that worries us, because they're like, either we're going to have to fund them so much that they're able to substantially work against these domestic forces, which Griffin tells you will always be aligned on anti-liberal grounds because they are the entrenched party and they're strictly controlled by that party. Or you mean sort of like just information and technology, like Fire Chat, which gets around the technological blocks of communication in China, was developed in Hong Kong without our help. So if it's that sort of fringe involvement that you actually need, we tell you that it's happening in China, and it's happening at a level that isn't scaring the Beijing government. Yes?
Even if we accept the Chinese government has the institutional capacity to crack down across the entire population, the use of riot shields and methods like that against the Hong Kong protesters escalated the protests and pro-democracy sentiment, meaning you're likely to see more of those protests even if you go for that mechanism.
Right. So even if you get individuals who, outside of Hong Kong, see that oppression and respond to it thinking, yes, more democratic protests are what they need, you're not going to be able to act on that sentiment because, first of all, you're afraid personally for your own safety, and second, because you see these individuals who are trying to participate in these protests being beaten, being confronted with riot shields, and not being efficacious. But secondly, because we tell you these anti-liberal policies will restrict your ability to collectively act. And then they're like, guys, this isn't like Iraq and Afghanistan, this is way more like Venezuela and Cuba, which was like obviously way optically better for the United States. Stellar argument. So now I want to talk about the trade-offs that the United States has to engage in if we want to really try to make this a policy that we put all our eggs in this basket. So first of all, we tell you that you're going to, so even if we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and we can still fund developmental aid in Africa, we can still fund other democracy programs, we tell you that we're still going to definitely have trade-offs in the international arena. Why? Because working with China in liberal institutions that they engage in willingly right now is necessary for any progress in those liberal institutions to actually be realized. Note, for example, in the Security Council, unless China and the United States are both willing to support a bill providing for sanctions, or they're both willing to provide support or troops or financing for something, bills and resolutions cannot be passed through the United Nations. So if you want to see some sort of like massive environmental reform, Vinu, we think you're going to have to realize that that meaningfully trades off in terms of our political capital in negotiating with the Chinese government. We also tell you that you're going to lose allies in the region as China tries to secure itself more steadfastly as a regional hegemon. We tell you that right now China's concluding negotiations with, for example, South Korea to form a free trade agreement where they'll undercut the United States' ability to engage in trade in the region, strengthening China's political capacity, and that is strengthening the government which exists in China currently, making it even harder to stop them from being so entrenched. So we think you're going to lose that trade war, which is economically devastating for the United States. The last thing we tell you is that you're going to trade off with the domestic attention that's paid to important issues within the United States. We do believe that people are capable of paying attention to more than one issue at a time. We're pretty good at it. But the news cycle is only about 3 weeks long. And honestly, in America, if we forget about the Ferguson protests for a month, we're not going to come back to them, because also what you're going to get is when the United States says, we think that it's worth risking Chinese lives and American lives to devote these resources and attention to China, you're not only going to get distraction, you're going to get active resentment that the United States is fulfilling obligations it has to China and not in its own backyard. We're proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for her remarks, and this House is now pleased to recognize the member of government to continue the case for the entire government bench. Got it.
Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, there is a perfect storm brewing in China. With a little help from the United States, we think that we could see the democratic reforms and see a democratic shift that we both desire in this round. I think that what OG gave you in this round was why we should fight for the principles of democracy within China. What we're going to give you are the hard impacts in the United States' interests that we want to see realized and how we think this policy will further those ends. First, I'm going to give you the mechanism of how we think this change will occur in China, something we also didn't get from opening government. Then we're going to give you some explicit refutation of what we heard out of OO. Then I'm going to tell you how this improves the United States' interests economically, in regards to climate change, in regards to international relations and security. Let's get going. So first of all, the mechanism. We think that the Chinese government is one party, but it has a lot of dissent and a lot of internal infighting within the party. Recognize that, and I'm going to be the first person to say his name in this round, Xi Jinping has an upper circle that disagrees a lot and has led to contradictory policies. For example, we see things like more military aggression towards Japan, but more cooperation with South Korea. So this also means that, it means there are people vying for different positions and advocating for different positions, constantly rotating power within this government with different views, many of them more liberal, moving towards liberalization. But there's also hugely different governing bodies because of the large nature of China. Recognize that there's more economic liberalism in Shenzhen and more economic conservatism in Sichuan. So if you pressure changes in the bargaining power because of the bargaining power of the people, this means that internally, along the upper elites, along Xi Jinping, are going to lead to power because they're the ones that are going to actually be able to satisfy the demands of the people within the country. And recognize further, if you're able to instigate large-scale regional changes within those governments, you can also leverage them against each other, and we'll see all of these things come to realization. So these things so recognize that often dissent in like regional areas or in particular sections from the people have worked in small ways, that we've seen little regression, little bits of liberalization and moving towards these ends. But because China has been able to effectively isolate them and basically keep it from contaminating and spreading to a larger way because their resources would be spread too thin and they would have to make too many concessions, has been very successful. What the United States needs to do is make sure that they can no longer contain those. They can no longer be kept to just Hong Kong and not have further contamination where this instigation can continue to move towards that democratic outcome. So, a little bit of refutation from what we heard from OO. So, here it is. Okay, so first of all, they talk about how this is going to happen organically. And I think a lot of their case rests on this because insofar as they seem to agree that a communist China with a hard state hegemony is no longer tenable, they have to win that it will happen organically for their side to be tenable.
They didn't even try to win that. They didn't give us any arguments of how it would work. So first of all, they need to prove that there's any efficacy. And there's a huge interest from the Chinese Communist Party in maintaining the status quo because they have a huge investment in maintaining state power. It allows them to elevate themselves. Corruption allows those leaders to continue to benefit themselves through this way. And they're like, look, they're going to violate human rights. They're going to bring out the tanks. That's why the propaganda is so effective. So first of all, if this is true, then this is one more reason why it will never happen organically on their side of the house, and they're able to back up all of those guarantees. But we tell you that it's only effective for China to do this on a small scale because of the enormous nature of their country and their large population. When you spread the resources very thin, and also because of the rise of the internet, things like the success of Weibo and connecting people in protests, especially in Hong Kong and other parts of China, this means it's harder to contain it on these scales, and it means that fundamentally, when you have a large-scale amount of unrest, a large-scale amount of people vying for democracy, they're not going to be able to do Tiananmen again. Look, we live in a post-Tiananmen world. The international world will not allow for China to continue to participate in the markets that they do and participate in the international institutions that they do if we have another Tiananmen. They know that that is untenable. They know that they're not going to be able to do it. And they're not going to be able to hide it because of the rise of the internet and the way that people are communicating through mesh networks and those sorts of things in these protests. No, thank you. So, moving on to talking about what the actual interests of the United States are in this interest beyond kind of a rosy picture of democracy, which we think is nice, but probably not a reason to do this exclusively. So first of all, economically, recognize that China has an enormous influence on the global economy and is an enormous competitor and affects greatly the ability of American goods to sell overseas, as well as things like currency control. So what do the people of China want, as opposed to the differences of what we've seen from state leadership? So first of all, they want more purchasing power. In poor regions in central China, the money from a day's work can't buy a gallon of milk. People are starving, people are getting completely alienated from their ability to actually buy any goods and live a quality life. We think that people are going to agitate first and foremost for increasing that purchasing power. In multi-coastal areas, there are huge luxury taxes that make it impossible for people to get things like a MacBook, for example, something we would like to sell a lot of. Like the first thing that people ask for when they have friends that go to the West is buy me a MacBook so I don't have to pay the giant luxury taxes. And these are the kinds of goods that they would be importing directly to China, to the enormous boon of the United States struggling economy if we were able to actually liberalize these markets and remove these sorts of luxury taxes. But we think that furthermore, there would be an enormous push for reducing the devaluation of the yuan. This increases purchasing power and helps American manufacturing. Recognize that also the devaluation of the yuan has led to things like the wild speculation bubble in the housing market, which is possibly going to burst and lead to a global currency crisis because of the interactions between the markets through the United States and China. Recognize that also the American Midwest has been collapsing as car manufacturers and metalworking gets cheated by Chinese goods that are artificially discounted by their monetary policy. Sure, back half.
If it is true that these types of policies are already happening on some type of incremental level, which all of your warrants seem to presuppose, why, if making them more explosive in their types of protests, would you not see more explosive crackdowns?
So what we tell you is they happen on an incremental level because of this dissidence, and then we see that they have to have a crackdown because things like Hong Kong happen, and they see that they cannot have this dissidence be what governs their party, and they start to peel those things back. As soon as Hong Kong happened, the liberalization started peeling back. What we tell you is this is going to be the constant fight, and there will never be full democratization. You need to have an all-out coordinated campaign that allows for this democracy to spread to every region of China and influence every member of the government. This is the only way that it'll ever actually be realized, rather than incremental forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, we think that furthermore, we would tell you this creates better relations for things like climate change. China is the biggest barrier to global climate change in 2 ways. First, it's the biggest contributor to the problem, and second, dragging their feet against further stalling from places like the United States. Politicians in the United States have their hands tied because they can't compete economically with China while simultaneously reducing their carbon emissions. This is a problem that's affecting Chinese citizens on a day-to-day basis in a tangible way. A day in Beijing is like smoking a pack of cigarettes, and people are tired of seeing their children fall ill, and they want to agitate for this change. If we encourage this on a widespread basis, I think this is something that would be hugely enormously effective and would untie the hands of other Western nations that would like to be doing more. But lastly, in regard to international relations, because recognize we're seeing a rise of younger, more liberal individuals who are not living in the same World War II mindset that their parents lived in. These are people that do not want to fight a war and bicker over the Senkaku Islands, the East China Sea, and other disputed territories. We think that they're going to instigate for more internal policies that increase their qualities of life, rather than increased militarization and aggression in the region, which threatens stability for the United States and all actors. For these reasons, we're proud of those.
We thank that speaker very much for her remarks, and this House now recognizes the member of opposition to continue the case for the entire opposition bench.
Taylor was right. All we need to do within this round is to demonstrate to you why a gradual democracy will be better than a fomented democracy. This is the only burden sufficient. Luckily, that's the stuff I've been prepping for 45 minutes. At this point in the round, I think we have never gotten a sufficiently good defense, and there's no constructive material left for why you will actually get away with this. Is money really that easy to launder to people in a state-controlled economy? I don't know. I also don't think we ever got a really good defense of a real likelihood of success. So, I'm going to do three things within the speech. The first thing is I think I'm going to beat both of the best arguments we've gotten, one from Vinu and one from Taylor as their success story, and why I think neither of those arguments are sufficient. Then I'm going to demonstrate to you why a gradual democratization is going to happen under the very logic they demonstrate. And then third, all we have to demonstrate then is why such a gradual democratization is far better than a fomented one, and I think we will have done sufficient work to win the round. So, one short argument at the beginning though. We definitely know that this will endanger those individuals who you give the money to, even if it's clandestine. Why? So first of all, who are the people that the United States is most likely to contact? And the most known people in China who seem like the best democratic ideologues. The problem is though, if those people get caught, they go from being ideologues who are principled to people who are taking foreign money who will be executed. The problem then is that if there is a gradual move toward democratization, they necessarily have a problem on their side where they foment it by giving money to individuals, which actually makes them more vulnerable, which leaves a chance then that the best leaders for democracy right now in China could potentially be cracked down upon by their very method. That seems particularly problematic at the point that if we can prove that a gradual democracy might be a better one, they would be intentionally keeping that from happening because they are too ambitious. Remember, fomenting just means exciting and moving too fast forward. I think that's important on their side. So what are the two arguments I'm going to beat? The first one is from Vino. I think he makes an interesting point where he's like, this worked in Eastern Europe. Guys, this worked in Eastern Europe because we fomented the democratic revolution against Soviet client states in 1989 when the Soviet client states were falling apart because the Soviet Union was falling apart and they didn't have the military backing to make sure they could crack down upon that unrest. Does that sound analogous to 2014 China? 2014 China has the military and financial resources to crack down upon this. And if such a crackdown would be worse for democracy in the long run, lead to people dying, leading to unrest and blood on our hands because we have so much ambition coming from government when they try to claim benefits they didn't warrant how they will receive, I don't think that's morally acceptable. I'm going to respond to Taylor's argument against next though. She says that the leadership is not homogenous, that there is will for democracy right now, and the problem is that it is compartmentalized. How do you decompartmentalize a movement towards democracy with clandestine funding of people, right? There's no way they actually get to a national movement towards democracy. They just fund individual leaders, which seems like all they're doing is just making the current status quo, which they already concede is bad because it's cracking down on democracy, just that much worse. The problem is the model never sufficiently gives us the links to the vision towards an access in the office that Taylor wants, which means even though I think we got a damn good member of government, it's not going to be good as what you're getting on closing opposition. So, what are we telling you then? It will happen slower on their side at best. So all we need to do then is prove that we think a gradual democracy will be better. Why do we think that? Yeah, sure, go for it.
Even in the best case scenario, the gradual advocacy that you take will take at least a century, at which point we'll have a currency collapse, global instability in the region, and climate change that can be irreversible.
Don't worry, I'll deal with your arguments. They were good. I still think I can beat them. So, what are we going to tell the owners of the house? We fundamentally believe in economic stage theory, which is essentially the simple premise that as you move towards stages of economic development, you also then have to necessarily achieve stages of political development due to the creation of a middle class. So, in industrialized China needed a state-controlled economy because they were able to harness the innovations of other states and industrialize to create a broad base of the economy which is able to catch up to other people. The problem is, though, if China wants to become the world hegemon and world economic innovator, they have to allow for innovation, which means there need to be political structures that actually allow for the development of a free-thinking middle class, because you need to educate individuals to create the broad consumer and intellectual base that is able to intellectually innovate on the mainstream. We think this is already happening in China. This responds to Taylor's POI, though, right? Because it indicates that we actually think this move is already happening. It's not a century away. It's what China's already moving towards. But necessarily, then, if you need a broad base of liberalization in order to become the kind of innovative economy which could actually beat economies like America, that means that we have identified legitimate economic incentives to political liberalization, which means that even the current political status quo allow for democracy. Additionally, though, we never got a substantive ideological argument as to why China hates democracy, merely that they like their current power structure, which means we can easily then assert that they might continue to give more and more concessions slowly over time. I also think, though, that there's a particular problematic on their side of the house when we already know China wants to move towards a consuming middle class. Once this is proven within the round, it seems then that that would naturally lead towards more political liberalization, which seems particularly effective. So, at this point then, I think that we've proven that China is moving towards the direction of a gradual democracy. All we need to demonstrate is that the kind of democracy they're getting is a far less predictable one in a lot of harmful ways. Why do we think that? First of all, just a general overview over this. We don't really know what the democracy they're going to get is, so they can't claim the solvency of this becomes the ideal China. For instance, you can foment a democracy that knows you out of craven self-interest funded them, and then still hates America, or is still tremendously nationalistic, or is still tremendously racist, right? Or still wants to beat America economically, or still doesn't care about pollution. All of these things can happen and also be a democratic state. I think a great example of this is when we had revolution in Egypt, right? It didn't lead to an ideal Egypt, it led to the Muslim Brotherhood, right, ladies and gentlemen? I think the particular problematic assumption on there then is that they actually bought into the premise that democracy alone is the means towards predicting the quality of a state. What we have said, rather, is that it's the combination of the economic development of the state and the political development of the state that can actually predict the actions of said state, and therefore we think history is moving in the right direction. Go for it, Pete.
This is ultimately, though, a comparison of whether or not we status quo you think China will have better U.S. relations, or it is more likely in a world where the U.S. is funding the institutions that led to a revolution that they are more likely to support.
Right, so there's three tiers on why we're beating them, right? The first one is that we just don't think they'll succeed. They haven't sufficiently warranted that. The second thing we say is that if they fail, it's very likely they'll hurt a gradual democratization, which they've already said they really care about. The third thing we've then demonstrated is that even if they succeed, we have not gotten nearly sufficient empirical or even logical analysis as to why we'll get the kind of country we want, other than they'll appreciate we gave them money. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, are people that dumb? Are they, right? Do people really believe the United States is doing this because they want a better China? Definitely not. They're going to see it as power projection, right? They're going to see it as a continuum of a polar ideology of we're upset you're beating us economically, so we're trying to necessarily destabilize you. And this is how China will see it necessarily. Even if they come into power, they'll be happy they took power. But remember, politics is about power. It's not about paying people back. It's about seeing what you can get in the future. And if you have this massive state apparatus with massive economic power, you're not going to be beholden to the very people who, under a Chinese nationalist ethos, which they never show they actually undermine, will still want to beat us because they have the capability to do so. I think we have sufficiently demonstrated then that a gradual democracy will be a moral outcome, that they heard that on their side of the house, that we have no guarantee of the outcomes they tried to claim, even though they might have a chance at getting a democracy. Insufficient to give us.
We thank our speaker very much for his comments, and this House is now pleased to recognize the final speaker, the government whip.
This is now an act. How will this happen? Asks John. Well, I think we told you. I think when you give money to the people who are already doing the agitating and make it such that they can in fact spend more time writing blogs, can in fact outreach more to other areas of China where we think uprising and at least some kind of civilian demonstration is necessary, it makes it such that those individuals who are starting to create the change can do it much more effectively while their financial networks are being tried to crack down by China. We actually think it's incredibly plausible that the US can do this in a clandestine fashion. I'm going to explain a little bit of explicit rebuttal when we heard out John, then address sort of the key issues of the debate, which is when should we do this, how will change happen, and then what can the US get out of it, because I think that's what the debate is. So, first explicit rebuttal of, well, money makes people vulnerable and that'll make it worse so we can't even get the change in the first place. Interesting argument. Here's the problem. The problem is that there are tons of ways that you can in fact get people money in a clandestine fashion if that's the most important thing that you want to do. Recognize that organized crime still does exist a huge amount within China, and there are financial networks that are being able to transfer money. But it's also true that more recently, the rise of online banking has made it such that when you're trying to avoid state banks, which tons of people are trying to do in China, there is a mechanism through which you can get funding to certain individuals. Also, the kinds of untraceable communications which have been able to be set up with respect to setting up different routers, and I'm not a technician, but it is in fact possible that you can have clandestine communications with individuals, especially in China, where there is a huge network that's been set up for this kind of a thing already. And even if it's not secret, I think they would have had to prove to you why this is going to be any different than what China already does whenever there's agitation, which is go, well, the foreigners did it. Look, they're trying to agitate in ways that they are trying to destabilize us. They said this in Tiananmen. They're saying this in Hong Kong. The people don't believe it anymore because they recognize that there are changes that need
need to happen, that there are problems on the ground which need to be addressed and which other people want. The fact that these things are true means that saying foreign agitation is happening does not negate the fact that the government needs to change when there is tremendous domestic pressure that is affecting them. But we hear that all we need is just gradual growth, and gradually over time this kind of a thing will happen. So we think, yeah, in the best case scenario, our policy turns over and there's democracy tomorrow. But we think what's more likely to happen is the fact that the government is going to be pressured by individuals who are now able to voice their opinions in ways that they haven't been before, especially on a macro level. I'm going to address that as with respect to how this kind of a change can in fact happen. Recognize this, that when there is an isolated problem, there is an isolated response by the Chinese government. When Hong Kong is a problem, they send out the police and they send out the riot gear and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is that all of the attempts that China has tried in recent decades to make sure macro problems go away have been radically ineffective. So violent opposition to protesters has not worked, like 1989 showed us that, and the fact that that could never, ever happen today for arguments that Taylor gives you, but also for the fact that they just couldn't hide it in the same way that they could 40 years ago, in the way that Weibo now exists and people can in fact communicate over microblogs and other ways to communicate within China. But also the fact that other options, so violence didn't work, changing people's minds with the media hasn't worked insofar as they have been able to get those kinds of microblogs and communications, and hard lines hasn't worked either when they tell Hong Kong, no, we're just going to stop doing this, and Hong Kong pushes back more. All of the efforts at making sure that isolated or macro problems go away have not been successful for China. The last one, and the one that they have tried in the past but are trying less now, particularly because of Hong Kong, are the ones in fact that say we're going to make reasonable concessions. When should we do this? We tell you the reason now is the right time is because there's dissent within Xi Jinping's inner circle. We talked to you about contradictory policies which actually do show us as concrete evidence that there are dissenting factors within the party. But also slowing economic growth down to 6 or 7% has shown us the fact that it is true that China does in fact need to make these kinds of changes now because people are getting upset. And most importantly, the response, how Hong Kong has happened. And the fact that the party has pushed back and is starting to say no now because in the same way that we've talked about, an isolated problem targets or yields an isolated response. Here's the difference, is once we create the kinds of more widespread displeasure and displeasure within the Chinese population, we make it such that China will have to respond in a way that makes it such that they have to make concessions now. Because if it's isolated, you can say, no, these people were wrong, now let's make you an example. But when it becomes a macro problem across the scale of China, that's when the government needs to address it in such a way that they make concessions because that's what the people want, and the people will not accept it anymore. The government does need to hold power. They want to maintain that kind of control, and that's what they are able to. That's what they're able to do when they start making those concessions. That's what they're not able to do in a world in which the population no longer trusts them to make the kinds of changes that the people demand, that the people need because of the economic realities and other kinds of realities of today. So how will change happen? We tell you change happens with respect to internal power, because within the dissent that exists within the Chinese Communist Party, it is not a monolithic group. There's tons of dissent within every level of the party, which makes it such that there is a constant negotiation of bargaining power of the individuals within the party. Insofar as the people, we're not saying fund those people within Xi Jinping's inner circle, we're saying fund the agitators who are on the ground, which makes it such that those people who are within the inner circle have much more bargaining power to make the kinds of change which are necessary in China and that the people demand. That's what we give you on our side of the house. We show you how change happens because those people get more negotiating power and can change the policies. That when they do have massive dissent and massive people being upset, that's when you get the actual kind of change that's important. I'll take the back half.
Okay, so Matt,
John.
what opportunity do we really have on your side to predict what a new democracy would look like? Or how we can predict what kind of economic actions they would take if we've gotten an act of insolvency from your side and they're a brand new government?
So what we say is we don't think it's terribly likely that there will be a massive overhaul of government tomorrow. If that happens in long-term, cool. What we think is more likely to happen is a policy shift towards the kind of thing which the people want, which is democratic, what the democratic will of the body actually wants. So the fact that change can happen with the blogs and people who are doing the agitation now, and the internal power structures and the regional autonomy that people can gain, that's how you get these kinds of things to change. And when these kinds of changes oftentimes have to happen on a national level, like the change of the currency, that's when you get these kind of change when there's a massive
outspoken opposition to those kinds of things. So what can the US get? I think we've shown you convincingly that these kinds of changes can be effected and can be most effective right now before we let the regime take a harder stance off of Hong Kong. Now that we can get the entire population on the side of what we think they need, we think we can in fact change the economic policies of the regime because the people do want purchasing power, they want less devaluation, which is exactly what the US needs to keep our manufacturing alive, which is exactly what the US needs to make sure that we can have freer trade in the rest of the world and that other people in Southeast Asia aren't doing the same thing, that we can prevent the kinds of housing bubbles which are problematic, that we can prevent the kinds of environmental destruction which the Chinese people don't want either. Now that we get an outspoken opposition to those things, we can get those kinds of changes and we can get a more moderated international relations. I think Taylor showed you how all of these impacts can come to fruition, that we've given you, the fact is that these kinds of changes need to happen. They need to happen now, and this is the way to do it. We're incredibly proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for his remarks and welcome the final speaker of the entire debate, the opposition whip.
All right, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to begin by noting the interesting pivot that we get out of the government whip speaker. How up and down the government bench, we're talking about this being an actual tipping point. This is a specific moment in history when we need democracy now, and democracy can arise now. Lastly, I think probably in response to John's pretty good arguments about how democracy should probably arise organically and naturally and over incremental, gradual change, we get from the last speaker that actually what we're always talking about was minor concessions that are eventually going to lead to democracy in the long run. Firstly, I think this is a pretty serious fact, not only of his partner, but I think it's a gradual shift of the case that actually undermines the impacts that the government was trying to talk about, talking about climate change being at a tipping point, talking about currency markets being at a tipping point, and talking about manufacturing being at a tipping point. I think that tension is very emblematic of the strength of Jonathan's arguments. But secondly, I don't think he actually really assessed the actual factors that can determine what a democracy would look like, specifically having to do with nationalism and power projection. Look to the example that we gave from Egypt. It's damning that they don't concede with this. And I think that we can win on a couple of levels. But first, let's get into summation of the round. So let's ask a couple of questions. Will the mechanism work? I think the answer is no. I think we've proven this all up and down the opposition bench, and I'm going to bring back opening opposition arguments because I think certainly there was sufficient. Secondly, will democracy rise organically? And I think that you can say absolutely yes, because there are not a lot of responses to come out of John's argumentation, talking about specific profit motives that the existing party structure and the existing political structure has to actually create the factors that create a democracy in the long run. How will this, and then we're going to talk about what the democracy will look like and how it will affect the U.S., China, and in fact the global relationship, because I think the harms that they're actually risking are pretty significant. So firstly, will the mechanism work? We say that if you're actually causing more uproarious dissent, more explosive dissent on a higher multiplicity of levels, what Taylor wants to do being breaking down the monolithic party control by creating some type of compartmentalization, is functionally significantly harmful if you're doing it via clandestine means. I think the only analysis that you get coming out of the last speaker says that China has been gesturing towards foreign aggression or foreign involvement for a whole long time, but this is functionally different when you're actually risking pulling people out, putting them in the media and saying they actually got real American money. We think this is a much more real step that they're taking, and these individuals not only will probably be executed, but will probably increase significantly the amount of nationalism and the amount of distrust that a bunch of Chinese people have towards the growing democratic movement. I think that's specifically pernicious. But secondly, I think the crackdown that you get towards specific types of dissent is in relation or correlative to the aggressiveness of the dissent that we're talking about. This is the material that we got in the opening opposition. The more explosive the dissent, the more well-funded the dissent, the more widespread the dissent, the more the party is going to freak out and want to crack down on this particular type of dissent. Specifically when after 2012, after the Bozulai scandal, the party is very, very, very scrutinizing of the types of corruption that are happening within the party itself. So there's actually a lot of in-party oversight to itself to ensure that people are not participating in money laundering, which John tells you is much harder to do, especially on the institutional level, and they're looking all over the place for the types of corruption that we're talking about. So I think that the incremental factors that we're actually going to see are not going to be things like concessions, but they're going to be things like crackdowns, they're going to be things like demonizing individuals that are democratic, that are potentially going to alienate large bodies of the democratic push towards democracy in China, and I think that that's bad for the long run. So why will democracy rise organically? Note that the entire government bench is noting a particular climate, a political climate of democratic push by the people in China. I think this actually coincides functionally with the economic interest of China as a hegemon moving forward into the future. I think that these particular economic economic interests means more education, the creation of a broad-based middle class, having to do with the economic basis of political development that Jonathan talked to you about, the creation of intellectual sectors, the creation of finance sectors, and the creation of their own innovation. They have an actual profit and a motive for expanding their own political power, and I think that these things actually will lead to a consuming middle class in the long run, so you won't see like small points of concessions, you'll see actual broad-based reform to accommodate this particular middle class because it's making China, broadly speaking, money. I think China is going to be it's going to be incentivized by the expansion of their political and economic power. And I think that this actually can prove that China is incentivized in and of itself, even the party, to like give some type of benefit to these democratic institutions. So, what will the democracy look like? Before I go on, I'll take one.
Gov Bench has said that democratic unrest leverages the liberal elements within the Chinese government for both short-term policy outcomes the United States wants and long-term democratic reform. How do you get either of these things the same? You see, insofar as you want the same protest mechanism, but have it on smaller scales that can be isolated and aren't as effective as our policy.
I actually think that the small scales are not as small as you're talking about. And I don't think they're isolated as you're talking about. I think there's a significant amount of communication in China between these incredibly disparate elements. I think they actually can come together, and I think that I just gave you a pretty nuanced explanation about how the economic factors and the economic incentives of the Chinese ruling structure are actually going to push towards creating more educated people that are going to push for democracy on a wider level. So I think all of that neatly responds. So what will the democracy look like? We think democracies in immediate transition are going to be incredibly prone to the types of radicalization that we have seen in the past from places like Egypt. Note that nationalism is a significant problem in China, especially like in the current day. You still have a tremendous amount of hatred for America, and I think you can still have a tremendous amount of nationalism. And I think the type of explosive democratic change they're talking about, not only if it will be met by crackdown, but if you concede a lot of their arguments, is not going to create a type of stable democracy that includes institutions like financial sectors, like innovation sectors, that can be internationally competitive. So I think this is incredibly bad. How will this affect the general balance of global power, specifically the US-China relationship? First of all, note the risks. I think the risks are far underblown by the government side. If this ever comes out that the US is actually funding like parties that are trying to break down the Chinese ruling party, it's not just propaganda that we have to be worried about, it's an actual trade war. Look to their own arguments about currency markets and manufacturing and the amount of trade that we were participating in with China. Like, how many of these could be completely cut off if China realizes that we're actually trying to take away their political power? They could even like put a ban or an embargo on lithium, which like half of the American car market needs to actually produce cars, because they have like 85% of the world's rare earth metals in China. I think these are significantly pernicious. Then they talk about climate change. They want to gain access to like this massive climate change benefit, and I don't think you can, because I don't think that democracy is instantly going to be a democracy that really cares about climate change. And even if they did, you can't take away 55,000 coal manufacturing plants overnight. I think you can't stop the actual engine of Chinese industrialism. So you have to work within the pre-existing economic incentive structure that they have to create a more educated population base, which I think will happen in the status quo. So what have we told you? We think the status quo actually solves in creating a more long-term, more stable democracy that is actually responsive towards a more educated populace and a wider political class with more purchasing power and more political power. We think that's better. I think that the risks that you're entailing going with the government plan, and just assuming that the United States can implement an incredibly clandestine operation with a highly scrutinizing Chinese polity is incredibly risky, especially given that they control a significant amount of not only the US economy, but the world economy. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.